with me from Copenhagen, I have Kirsten Brosböl, a politician, or should I say former politician. Kirsten was one of these successful, bright, young people who joins politics, becomes member of parliament, even in Kirsten's case, also part of the government, until she decided that that was not really what she wanted. So Kirsten, briefly talk us through what went wrong.
Well, I decided a couple of years into my last term that I wanted to try something else in my professional career and also in my personal life. So I guess you could say that there were both some personal and political factors that made me decide not to run for re-election in the election that then came in 2019. So I ended up spending 14 years in the Danish parliament, and as you said, part of that time as a minister as well. And I would say that, you know, there are both push and pull factors, but I think some of the push factors was the culture, you can say, of what kind of behavior that is rewarded within the political system. I found that increasingly MPs were not being involved so much in policy design, policy development, but it was much more a job that consisted in communicating what was decided on a more sort of leadership level. And the type of behavior that was increasingly being rewarded was whether you were sort of a terrier, someone who could attack your opponent, someone who was good at, getting into the media, increasingly, of course, going into the infights on social media platforms. So I guess when I sort of did my math about where I wanted to spend the rest of my professional career, I found that I would like to try to see things from the outside and perhaps also reflect a little bit about the state of democracy, because I really feel that there are some challenges that also the political culture needs to work with in order to make sure that we continue to have a legitimate democracy.
So when you look at it and include the media in what you look at, what do you see when you talk about the political culture in a democracy such as the Danish one?
Well, I think it's evident that the news criteria that exists within the media world also affects the way that politicians behave. And when I say that the behavior that is rewarded is also how much are you able to be exposed in the media, be visible, both to your political leadership, but also to your constituency and to the voters, then of course the news criteria are critical to who will be able to enter the news feed, right? So if the news are very much focused on conflict and infights between political parties and increasingly also on the political leadership, it is extremely difficult if you are the type of politician who is working in a more constructive manner, trying to work across party lines, which I was doing in my last term as the chairman of an all-party group working on sustainable development. I found that it was really difficult to present that type of news and about the work that I was doing, that I of course found was really important, because there were other agendas that were more interesting to media. And this is not something I say because it's not a personal issue for me, but it's more like a general issue that I think we need to have this interaction between the media and the political world to see whether there are some things that we in both cultures need to work on in order to make sure that the news that are presented to our constituents are also representative of what it is that we actually do as politicians. I respect deeply my political colleagues. They all enter into politics because they are passionate and because they want to change the world, basically, coming from, different specters of politics, but everyone has this drive. But somehow, is it's sometimes not the picture that people have, because they see the infights and the criticism, and the focus on these sort of personal scandals or whatever it could be. So I don't think the news really reflects what happens on the political arena, and what content wise what it is that we're actually working on.
You went on from leaving parliament, and then you actually lived in the United States for about a year, because you were a fellow with the Obama Foundation at Harvard. And what were discussions there? Could other people from around the world, did they feel the same thing, or was this an isolated Danish phenomenon?
So I was at Columbia in New York as an Obama scholar there. And the interesting thing for me also was to try and see this from an academic angle. And of course, have these discussions with people at Columbia who are working on democracy and the legitimacy of institutions, which is a huge deal, of course, also in America. And the interesting discussion for me was to see whether we actually across the Atlantic are facing some of the same challenges. And, obviously for me, this is the case on different levels and, different levels of intensity. But there is definitely no doubt that there is somehow a global legitimacy crisis of our democracies. There is lower levels of trust in politicians and governments. And this is something that is incredibly hard to work on from the inside. This was also some of my reflections that, it's really hard being a politician with that sort of, what comes with that title, because people will automatically be skeptical towards what you say. Or at least that's my experience. So it was really interesting to see from the outside, how could we perhaps try and work with, inspired by, the work that you are doing in constructive journalism, to see whether we could actually inspire a discussion around constructive politics, because I really believe that we need to have that same type of discussion within a political framework, to see if we can also perhaps come up with some principles or ideas on what would a constructive politics approach look like, and how could we begin to work with politicians and their constituents to build back this trust in politicians and in our representative democracies.
And you and I actually discussed could we create a democratic boot camp? And you left for United States, but the idea sticked. And we actually invited all the new elected members of the Danish parliament to a 24-hour session talking about this, creating networks, cross-party lines, and knowing what is the job you have as a politician, how do they avoid becoming part of this conflict culture? And they really loved it. It's really interesting. And is it true to say that there's a really huge interest in the United States for this kind of thinking, that you could also help politicians be a better version of themselves?
Indeed, in academia, I never got to the phase where I had this discussion with elected officials in the United States. So I can only talk about my discussions within academia, where this is extremely present, and a discussion that is taking place. And I found that there is a great potential if we could start to have this conversation also across the Atlantic, because the challenges we face are similar. And with this 24 hours that you are hosting now, I think all over the world we are facing some of the same challenges. So I would strongly encourage that we continue to have these discussions. And as you say, among my former colleagues in Denmark, and I also experienced this with colleagues around Europe in the European networks that I'm part of, there is definitely a consciousness about the challenges that we face, and that we also must work with this from within. so to speak, within the political parties, within the parliaments, to see how we can contribute to changing this culture.